thank you so much for being here. Thanks to everyone for being here as well. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thanks so much, Jennifer, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you after a few grueling weeks in Sharm el-Sheikh. It's good to be back in New York.
Grueling. So I was there as well, so I can second that. It was grueling. But let's just talk about the big headline that came out of COP. The Loss and Damage Fund, right? It was significant. It was a breakthrough is what people are calling it. How would you describe it?
It was historic. Prior to assuming this role, many eons ago, I was a negotiator for the Small Island Developing States. It's a group of about 40 countries, island countries in the Caribbean, Pacific, Indian Ocean. And one of the priorities that they've had over the course of the last 30 years is the creation of a funding mechanism or a fund to address the unavoidable loss and damage from the climate crisis. So this was extremely historic. We're not there yet. It's an important first step. The COP outcome now calls on countries, it will be about 24 countries or so, that will sit around the table over the course of the next year or so to design and operationalize this loss and damage fund. But it really was a historic step towards climate justice and addressing the needs of countries, communities, and people who are on the front lines of the climate crisis.
What does that look like, though, Selwin? I mean, because a lot of criticism was that there was not a lot of detail in the fund itself. I mean, what do the next 12 months look like leading into COP28, specifically with this fund?
Okay, as it relates to this fund, one of the first tasks will be to map out what is already there in terms of instruments, sources, and institutions that are already providing various forms of loss and damage support. And then over the course of this year, these 24 countries that are part of a group called a transitional committee that will design and operationalize this fund will then design a fund or a funding instrument that really helps to fill some of the gaps in the existing architecture for supporting loss and damage. The reality is that funding is already being provided for loss and damage, both in developed and in developing countries as well. We just had that horrific flooding episode in Pakistan. I read last week or this week in the New York Times that in the United States, funding is being provided for communities that are at risk from climate change. Funding is provided for them to relocate. That is an aspect of loss and damage. So we're already on individually and collectively doing loss and damage. It now needs to be done at a scale that is commensurate with what we know will happen with the climate crisis, what science tells us will happen to people, to communities, to infrastructure, to agricultural systems, to water. It now needs to be scaled up at a level that helps us to save and protect lives and livelihoods.
Did this fund, though, come at the expense of more ambitious climate action? Because that was a lot of the criticism as well, was that this fund was established, there's not a lot of details in the fund, but there was also there wasn't stronger language from COP26 about phasing down or cutting down emissions. So do you think there was a trade-off at this COP?
No, I honestly don't think that there was a trade-off. I'm one of those persons who believe that choosing between protecting people, adapting to the climate crisis, addressing loss and damage, and reducing emissions versus reducing emissions and closing the emissions gap, it's a false choice. We need to do both. We need to protect people, safeguard livelihoods, we need to adapt to the climate crisis, we need to address loss and damage, and simultaneously, we need to urgently reduce emissions. In terms of the outcomes from the COP, we went into COP 27 with fears that there would be significant backsliding on what was achieved on Glasgow. That did not happen. the language on 1.5 acceleration of mitigation ambition, revisiting nationally determined contributions, which are the, sorry to use acronyms, but NDCs are the currency of the Paris Agreement. It's the national climate plans of government. All of that was preserved in the outcomes of Sharm el-Sheikh. But we had more. We did not have an explicit reference to phasing out all fossil fuels, which some of us wanted, but that was not in Glasgow either. What we had this year was explicit references to accelerating the deployment of renewables. There was a new section on energy. It seems absurd that in a climate space, renewables have never been referenced before, renewable energy. And we know that renewable energy is the major solution to reducing emissions. And in Sharm el-Sheikh, we had explicit references to the need to accelerate the global transition to renewable energy, which is captured what I believe is a global consensus that with the war in Ukraine, with high fossil fuel prices, now is the moment for us to accelerate a renewables revolution. So there were significant gains capturing this emerging global consensus to accelerate the renewable energy revolution. And for the first time as well, there was extremely strong calls from all countries, not just developing countries or small countries, to really accelerate the reform of the multilateral development banks to make these institutions, which were created over 70 years ago, fit for purpose. Because we need these institutions, the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks, really to support poor and emerging economies, really to accelerate the deployment of renewables. So there were some gains from COP26. The reality is, however, and I must say this, the emissions gap is still wide. We did not narrow the emissions gap. And that's a reality that we need to own up to. And this is something that I believe that over the course of the next few COPs, the next few years, we really need to tackle this massive emissions gap. Renewables has to be the drumbeat of all of us, including all of you here in this room.
Was the UN disappointed at all from the private sector perspective in terms of, I know the UN came out with its own report on greenwashing and what more the private sector can do. Is there enough scrutiny that the private sector is getting at this point in time to cut back on emissions and the like that you're talking about? So
I wouldn't use the term disappointed, because many of the companies and financial institutions and non-state actors that have made net zero commitments have done it in good faith. Many of them want to do the right thing. The report that was commissioned by the Secretary General, because last year in Glasgow, we had a number of major announcements around net zero commitments.
And this year as well, the same.
And this year, yeah. Right? But with these announcements, came accusations and concerns, and I'll be very blunt, I'm not accusing anyone of greenwashing in this room, but came accusations and concerns over greenwashing. It was very hard to distinguish between those companies and financial institutions that wanted or were doing the right thing from those who simply wanted to use this net zero stuff as a public relations stunt, right? Let's be honest, some of them just wanted to use it as a public relations stunt. So Secretary General got really strong calls from many of the corporates and financial institutions that were doing the right thing, as well as from civil society and governments themselves, to bring together a diverse group of experts to look at what a credible net zero target means, and what should be the process and processes to measure, report, and verify the authenticity and progress towards meeting these net zero goals. And also to lay out a roadmap towards regulations, so making this mandatory for corporates and financial institutions. And that was what the group was all about. We believe that the 10 recommendations are extremely solid. They provide a how-to guide on what a credible net zero target is or should be, and what should be the pathway towards ensuring that this net zero target is credible. It should have interim targets. There should be a transition plan. Executive compensation should be tied towards its achievement. Companies that make these net zero commitments should not be engaged in negative lobbying against climate action. There should be a plan to phase out fossil fuel financing, and all emissions, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, should be covered under this pledge, as well as the underlying transition plans behind a net zero pledge. So I wouldn't say a disappointment, but this how-to guide hopefully will help corporates, financial institutions, and other non-state actors to set credible targets and should be seen as the benchmark for what a credible net zero target looks like.
Should be. And I mean, this week, over the past few weeks, we've seen the European Union go ahead and take their own approach as well in terms of setting these regulations. And we're seeing the private sector reacting a little bit negatively. I mean, so how do we move forward if this is where we're at this point in time?
Well, what we heard in Sharm el-Sheikh was generally positive reaction to many of the recommendations. Of course, the European Union has always moved faster in terms of regulations related to climate. Key will be to ensure that we have a level playing field globally. One of our main concerns, and this was reflected in the report, is to ensure that developing nations, as well as financial and corporate corporates in the developing world, are not left behind during this transition. But we believe that the recommendations that are in this report should form, I would say, a how-to guide, a guide of best practice. Now, regulations will ultimately, and this is a strong belief from the UN and from the Secretary General, ultimately we will need to go down the path of regulations to provide certainty and predictability to the private sector. Certainty and predictability is absolutely necessary. Companies and corporates and financial institutions should not operate in an environment where there are regulations in the EU, there's uncertainty in the US, uncertainty in Japan, etc. There needs to be somewhat of a level playing field, and at some stage, some convergence in terms of especially the larger economies going down a regulatory pathway. And finally, one of the recommendations was for the creation of a task force. A task force not dissimilar from the TCFD, but a task force that would look into this question of regulations across the board.
And you mentioned the Secretary General. I think we should mention that COP15 is happening right now in Montreal, the Biodiversity COP, and it's a huge opportunity for a Paris-like agreement, right? And the Secretary General had some pretty harsh words, should we say, about the way that the environment is being treated. Are you optimistic for any type of agreement on biodiversity at this point in time?
Well, hopeful. We have to be hopeful. If it were up to us in the UN, we would have global agreements on every global threat and challenge. But we all know that nature has been undervalued. And we really hope that countries, parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, that they will seize this moment really to agree on a comprehensive set of measures to reverse biodiversity loss. We will never win the fight against the climate crisis if we don't address biodiversity, if we don't halt this senseless war against nature.
Right, and we know scientists have echoed that as well. So, and I just want to end on COP28. I know you're still recovering from COP27, myself as well, but there's been a lot of criticism about COP28 being held in the UAE, and potentially, not seeing enough, even more progress next year, considering where it's being held, what could potentially happen there. Why hold it there? I mean, give us a little bit of background.
So, COPs move from across the 5 regions of the United Nations. COPs move from, so this year it was the African region or the African group, and next year the COP will be held in the Asian region. And the host or the COP president is selected by that regional group. So it's not a selection by the United Nations. But that being said, COP presidents have a role in terms of being neutral brokers of a very complex multilateral process. And we are confident that the UAE will follow the lead of other COP presidents. But ultimately, it is the countries themselves, the parties themselves, that make the final decisions, right? It will be the countries themselves ultimately under the leadership and the guidance of the COP president. But the reality is that Egypt has provided, or COP27 has provided a solid basis for us to deliver on protecting people, on the loss and damage fund, on doubling adaptation finance, on early warning systems. But we know what we need to do to close the emissions gap. It is about renewables. It is about supporting developing countries. And just yesterday, despite all the bad news that we've heard over the course of the last few weeks and months, the IEA released its annual report on the state of renewable energy for 2022. And that report shows that the deployment of renewables is accelerating at an unprecedented pace. Over the course of the next 5 years, under normal circumstances, normal conditions, we're set to increase renewable energy capacity by 2,400 gigawatts over the course of the next 5 years, which is equivalent to the total installed energy capacity of China. And this is under normal circumstances. Now, the report also says that if we're able to address some of the implementation challenges in developed countries, if we're able to lower the cost of capital, which is a major priority of the Secretary General for these investments in the developing world, the world can increase further to just under 3,000 gigawatts of installed capacity over the course of the next 5 years. So there is a good story to tell on what is actually happening in economies. We need to go much faster. We need to go much further. But the reality is, we have the technologies, we have the financial tools and instruments that are urgently needed over the course of this decade, because it is this decade that will make or break our attempt to hold the increasing global average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Well, and if this COP was about implementation, what will next COP be then about for the UN?
Next COP, I can't define the agenda for the UAE, but it has to be about acceleration, acceleration, acceleration. We have, time is running out. Science tells us this decade is the make or break decade for addressing the climate crisis. So all that we're doing on finance, all that we're doing on adaptation, all that we're doing on loss and damage, all that we're doing on mitigation and closing this massive emissions gap, it must be accelerated. So for us, it's about acceleration, 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 acceleration.
Selwin, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone.
Jennifer, thank you so much.